have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup.
And in the news this week, there's a lot of turmoil over LGBT rights legislation and anti-LGBT legislation, especially in Indiana.
We'll bring you up to date on some of that, and we'll talk about those scary Republicans who are moving forward toward the presidency. Watch out.
But there was a big breakthrough for transgender people seeking coverage of gender reassignment surgery.
And maybe good news in Harlem, New York City, where a virulently anti-gay church that we've told you about before could be transformed into a shelter for homeless LGBT youth.
After a 40-year battle, the New York City Public Schools has finally appointed a point person on LGBT issues.
A day late and a dollar short. The Mennonite minister who helped an ex-lesbian abduct her daughter from her former partner is now supposed to go to prison.
There's some alarming news on how the Mormon condemnation of same-sex marriage and denying baptism to the children of gay couples and things that we told you about before has affected LGBT Mormons.
Good news, an 82-year-old gay veteran is finally getting an honorable discharge.
In India, the Supreme Court there will reconsider its decision to reinstate the country's anti-sodomy law.
But a Chinese male couple who we've told you about who are suing for the right to marry had a picture of them kissing censored by a newspaper in Pakistan.
In New York City, at least, there's been a rise in the use of crystal meth by gay men, and it threatens the gains in reducing HIV infection.
Horrifying moment on the Bill Maher HBO show last week where he was lauding a quack scientist who was claiming a cure for HIV.
And no, Queen Latifah did not come out on the SAG-AFTRA Awards this past weekend.
We will explain.
All right.
But we start all over the U.S. with proposed legislation for and against LGBT people.
There are now, I guess, over 150 anti-LGBT bills in 30 states. And you can read all about these, by the way, by going to Equality Federation, we got this website up, equalityfederation.org, and you can read about tracking them in your state.
Yeah. But, for instance, in Indiana in this last week, a Senate committee passed what the right wing claimed was a pro-non-discrimination bill covering only sexual orientation, not gender identity, but it had a huge religious freedom clause, bigger than the law they passed last year that got them in so much trouble.
Don't they ever learn?
And it also had a prohibition on individual towns and cities passing better local laws. Charming.
Well, the interesting thing was that Freedom Indiana, which is the LGBT rights group out there, said they're deeply disappointed that the bill was deep-sixed because they said they thought they could fix it on the floor.
Yeah, but clearly they couldn't fix it on the floor. That's why it died. We're happy that it died in the form it died in, that it was passed out of the Senate committee.
I guess maybe they thought if we could have fair votes on amendments and things, they could make some progress on it.
Well, but they couldn't,
well,
by
that's
definition.
Why we need a federal LGBT. We need the Equality Act passed nationally, which would override what all these other places are doing.
Meanwhile, as they're arguing over various versions of these laws in Indiana, and there are more to come in Indiana, go to equalityfederation.org for details, the right wing is bringing lawsuits to attack all the non-discrimination laws that do exist locally in Indiana. They are relentless and shameless.
And you know, in Michigan, we told you that there was a group that was trying to push a ballot proposal on LGBT rights.
Well, that would have been a good one,
rights.
yeah.
Well, it would have been good, but except that most of the groups out there were against bringing it to a referendum.
Well, because they're scared.
Yes.
And, you know, which way do you go? We win some, we lose some. So they said, so the standard group said, we could lose this. It could be another Prop 8. Please don't try to bring this referendum for a public vote on our rights.
Well, never mind. They've abandoned the effort.
Yes, they said they didn't have enough money to push that forward. In South Dakota, the House there has passed an awful student bathroom bill
58-10.
that forbids transgender students from using bathrooms that conform to their current gender identity.
Just terrible.
Terrible.
Just terrible. But better news from Lewisburg, West Virginia, where the city council unanimously passed legislation to protect people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in jobs, housing, and public accommodations. Congratulations, Lewisburg.
Well, there are several towns and cities in West Virginia
Many.
that have been passing these laws without this kind of nonsense that's going on in other places.
And it's become such a conservative state in federal elections for these days, but it's sort of a reliable...
And Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, has not been a friend to us in the United States Senate for the most part, but somehow the firestorm of paranoia has not hit West Virginia on these bills, and it's very strange how it breaks out in some places but not in others.
Yes.
But it.
Well, yeah, I think that has to do with, well, they did it over there on the other side, you know, this part of the state, we could do it, they did it, we did it, that kind of stuff. We used to try to say that in New York when it took us 15 years to pass the gay rights bill. We said, the whole state of Wisconsin do it, can't we do it here? And every other big city had done it. It took us forever.
Well, they're having a big debate now in Georgia because there is a proposed Religious Freedom Restoration Act there, which will, again, protect religious liberty, which means allowing people to discriminate by making claims of a religious need to be mean to us.
Well, someone who is sowing all these religious freedom laws, and a bad person, is one of the architects of that weak Utah LGBT rights law. A University of Illinois professor named Robin Fretwell Wilson. She is now peddling it across the country, and she has worked with the right-wing Alliance Defending Freedom to defend Arizona's RFRA that was even vetoed by Governor Brewer. And her big goal is to let religious groups keep government money, to protect them. If they're getting government money, they shouldn't have to comply with human rights laws because they might have to be nice to gays. That's what she's doing. She's on the march about this.
I think that is a major reason that they're pushing these laws, because they saw what happened, and God knows they've yelled about this enough. In Massachusetts, when the Catholic Adoption Agency lost its government funding because it would not stop discriminating against same-sex parents. And they've used that ever since to say, watch out, if we have to conform to non-discrimination laws and we refuse to do it, we're going to lose our government funding.
And
yes, you are.
This is not just happening in Utah and Georgia and Indiana. New York City has a disgraceful record of giving public funds to anti-gay religious groups.
Yes, in New York, unlike in Massachusetts, you can go ahead and discriminate and not lose your funding.
Right, because even a lot of gay council members voted for that here. Outrageous, because that's where they see their political futures, with these blocks of Orthodox Jewish and fundamentalist Protestant and Catholic votes.
They're having these fights in Washington state, too, where a Senate committee voted 4-3 for repeal of a good trans bathroom rights bill. We're hoping this will die before it gets passed by the entire legislature, but it's, again, in a state that is considered pretty liberal, we are still facing these fights and losing some of them.
Well, we killed most of these bills last year,
Yeah.
including in Oklahoma and places like that. But with the ascendance of same-sex marriage since then, with the Supreme Court decision, that people like this University of Illinois professor, they're really on the march now about that, and it's going to be a different atmosphere.
Plus, you have all the Koch brothers' money going into the state legislatures on behalf of stuff like this, and the ALEC money, and you have the Republican presidential candidates ginning up this rhetoric that is anti-gay and pro-religious freedom, and making all these promises to do terrible things once they're elected.
Well, speaking of rhetoric, we all know that we lost that Houston vote badly about protecting the LGBT rights law there. Well, the guy who funded that effort is a right-wing guy named Dr. Stephen Hotsey, and he was speaking at a conference this week, and he said, 30 years ago, Caitlyn Jenner would have been locked up. These people are crazy as bedbugs. This is a wicked, evil, satanic movement. Now, these are the people who win. You know, it used to be you said things like this, we exposed them, and people said, oh, I don't want to be associated with that. And now they're winning.
Well, more about that in a moment. There was one thing we're following in Virginia is the case of Gavin Grimm, a trans guy, 16 years old, who is fighting for the rights to use the bathroom and locker room appropriate to his gender. They held a court hearing last week on that. We're awaiting developments on that. And in California, where they have passed, 10,000 pro-LGBT bills in the last few years?
Yes.
Equality California has proposed a new law that would require all single restrooms be labeled all gender. Now, I've kind of wondered why we needed that label. Why not just, just call it
water closet,
restroom? Yeah. But evidently, they seem to think you need a more proactive statement. That everybody is welcome in that restroom.
I think it should be the law everywhere.
I want to discuss for a minute before we get into the presidential candidates, as we're on this kind of legislation and the kinds of statements you made. The New York Times published something in their magazine section this last weekend about how homophobia is an inappropriate term. This is one guy's opinion, because it medicalizes bigotry.
Well, I used to kind of feel that way myself. I mean, and as a reporter, I started using the term, I wouldn't use homophobia or homophobic, I would say anti-gay bigotry or anti-gay prejudice. Then I met George Weinberg, who coined the term homophobia back in the late 60s and into the 70s.
And is credited with such in this New York Times piece.
But as George explained to me, the root of prejudice, of what people do to us, is based in fear. He said, look at a snarling dog. That dog is expressing fear when it snarls. And when two men are walking down the street and some straight guy or not feels he's got to beat them up because he's just seen them, what the hell is that about? I mean, that is more than just prejudice. It's sick. Now, the author of that article was sort of saying, well, you're letting them off the hook, you're excusing them because you're medicalizing it, but we're not excusing it. We're trying to understand it so that we can stop it.
And au contraire, I think not to label it as crazy or inappropriate in that way is to let them off the hook. It says that there's possibly some equivalence, that that kind of bigotry or prejudice might have a rationale. And for me, the analysis of something as homophobic is, does it have any possible rationale? And when I see things as irrational, that's when I start putting them in that category of insanity or phobia. Yes. Fear, whatever.
I mean, the word prejudice is also, of course, pejorative. There's no justification for it because it means you've prejudged somebody without knowing them, you just made a judgment because you don't like this group of people.
But why would you be prejudiced?
Well, fear of the other. And
exactly.
The author of that article said now we have xenophobia. Well, xenophobia. We had xenophobia has been a term for 100 years, I think, or more.
At least.
So.
On the other hand, I have friends who I was saying to one of them the other day who was talking about something entirely different. I said, you are just spouting cliches. You are not even thinking. You are just,
yes.
You've just given me a long list of cliches that have no relation to reality because these are prejudices you're spouting.
Which is why I don't watch Fox News.
Well, this had more to do with sports, I think, believe it or not. Wow. But I really took exception to this Times piece, and yes. I was discouraged that they would print something that was ignorant.
I wrote a comment on it.
More on that later when we get to Bill Maher.
But I talked to George about it, and he didn't care to respond. All right.
He's over it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to have a little discussion of that leading into these presidential candidates, because I think they are spreading this kind of yes. ignorance and fear very deliberately.
At every opportunity.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's so cynical.
Cruz and Rubio this week promised to pass the First Amendment Defense Act, the anti-LGBT bill that's in the Congress, in their first 100 days. It would let businesses and individuals discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the name of religious liberty. It has 152 House sponsors and 37 in the Senate.
Well, that's not enough to get it passed, and it is considered irretrievably stalled. But
they'll pass it in the first 100 days.
Oh, please! How many promises like that have we heard from candidates?
Well, they can do a lot of executive orders.
Well, that was the next phrase. They have promised to repeal all of Obama's executive orders. On day one. A lot of which have to do with things like forbidding federal contractors to discriminate yes. on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity.
Elections have consequences.
They're certainly not going to be pushing the Equality Act through Congress. And the cynicism of this, and again, we are in 2016 being scapegoated by these people for election purposes, and it's who can be more right-wing than thou.
I'm not homophobic. I'm just trying to protect religious liberty, which is a very cherished thing in this United States.
I'm not voting for you.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump has gotten religion in the course of this campaign.
Certainly more than he had 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, but he was pressed on what he would do about the fact that we've got same-sex marriage. He said he was disappointed in the Supreme Court decision, and he said he'd consider appointing justices to overturn that decision. And then he lost Iowa after saying this. Now, most people think it's because he didn't go to the debate.
Yes, you think it's because he's too pro-gay.
Pro-gay? That's anti-gay.
I do not want to be in the position of defending Donald Trump, although I found myself feeling a strange sympathy for him Monday night. But I will say that he was pressed into this. What he said was that he would prefer a states' rights approach as opposed to those who say we are evil incarnate. You know, these guys, many of them, not Trump, but Cruz and Rubio certainly, and Huckabee and all the rest, are hanging out with these really horrible, homicidal, virulently anti-gay preachers at all their rallies. If you start looking at who these guys are associating with, it's unbelievable. Trump said, yeah, he was pressed. He was, you know, would you appoint judges to overturn this? And he said, well, I'd consider it.
Consider it. But I think before I get too much email here, I think you better explain why you have some strange sympathy for him on Monday after the Iowa caucuses.
I don't know. I just think he's softening. It's when I look at Cruz and Rubio, and Rubio starts getting described as the mainstream candidate, I just my head starts to explode. I'm appalled, and no, I am not supporting Donald Trump for president. I do not want him elected, but I think along that continuum, I think he would make a deal.
The positions that Hillary and Bernie are taking are pretty pro-gay. Can we think of anything we want that they haven't come out for yet?
Well, not yet. But here's the deal: if HRC has compiled, facts about all of them, they have endorsed Hillary Clinton. Let's be clear about that. But they have a website or a section on their hrc.org website called Republican Facts, where they go down the list of everybody's positions on everything. So if you want to really parse these positions, you can look at the HRC website. The other thing is that GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, sent out a questionnaire to every presidential candidate, Republican, Democrat, the whole list.
Who responded?
The Democrats.
No, 0 Republicans.
Zero.
I mean, I remember when by the late 80s, I guess, the Republicans were trying to answer the Democrats by having a person with AIDS speak at the convention or something.
Mary Fisher.
Right, and that kind of stuff. But there was some element of trying to look compassionate, even though they weren't.
Those days are long gone.
Now it's just insane.
But literally not one Republican candidate's campaign answered the GMHC questionnaire. Now, a lot of it had to do with stigma and discrimination, and that may be what scared them off and said, we're not dealing with this. This is not just, medical questions or whatever.
All right.
And they're all out to destroy health care anyway, so why would they answer a GMHC questionnaire?
And the Eastern District is out to destroy rentboy.com. This was we were at the protest they closed them down. The Eastern District. This
is the website
for escorts.
Yes, where escorts can advertise their services.
It's been around since
20 years,
1996. It has had floats in the Pride Parade in which all the politicians march. Wasn't bothering anybody, but they have indicted Jeffrey Horant, 51, and added a money laundering charge to the other charges. They did not name the 6 other people who were arrested in this.
No,
but
they're pending, yes.
And the indictment is very homophobic.
As were the original charges when they arrested them. And he's charged with promoting prostitution and, as you said, money laundering.
Yeah. Not
good. Your government in action, even with the Obama administration in charge of the Justice Department.
Right.
All right. Shall we get to, let's get to a terrible story out of Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Monica Loera.
Leora, I think it is.
Loera.
Loera.
43 years old, trans woman, shot.
There she is.
Shot dead on the street.
And, yes. By a man that she was having a conversation with.
They've arrested him.
Yes, his name is John Casey Rowell.
She was, of course, misgendered by both the police and the media before that got cleared up. The one distinction here is that she is the first reported murder of a trans person in 2016. There were 22 reported murders in the United States of trans people in 2015. I still think that's only the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
But this becomes the first case. And I'm glad there's an arrest, at least.
Now, we only protect transgender rights statewide in New York through executive order by Governor Cuomo, and the Pride agenda is going out of business. So more than 70 LGBT groups and allies petitioned the Republican State Senate to pass GENDA, the Gender Equality Non-Discrimination Act, sent it to the Republican leader, who criticized Cuomo for doing an executive order. So
exactly.
they're saying,
they're calling his bluff.
Pass the bill.
Yeah, you say it has to be done by the legislature.
Do it.
Fine, do it. You're the legislature.
Right. What's the problem?
Exactly.
Address the issue.
Exactly. In Clovis, California, for some strange, unexplained reason, the school board trustees refused to update a gender-specific dress code, even though it flies in the face of the state law.
Well, I mean, this sounds like something I'd expect from a Catholic school where they can make all these kinds of restrictions, and I don't just mean to single Catholics out, but I mean, certainly when I went to school, you couldn't have your sideburns this or your hair long, but that's what it's about. It's about letting boys have long hair and wear earrings if they want to, and removing language that says dresses and skirts are only for girls, and they wouldn't do it. In fact, one of the trustees on the board said, "A woman's a woman and a man's a man, there's a difference." But the district does, so in protest of this, boys wore dresses to school. They were not disciplined for that.
Right.
But a girl wore a man's shirt which said on it, "The dress code sucks," she was disciplined. The district does say if a student is transgender, they will allow them to dress in their gender identity.
Okay. But they really need to change those rules.
Well, in New York City, they finally have a point person on LGBT issues. Jared Fox, 28, one of the who founded the New York City chapter of GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. This mainly happened because Danny Drum is out as an out gay teacher, and he's head of the education committee for the city council.
He's now on the city council.
And he heads the education committee. So it's a very big job, but I interviewed Jared. He's very energetic. He's trying to, cover all the bases. The biggest thing they're going to do is this thing they did in LA where they're going to have teachers wearing these lanyards that say out for safe schools so that any teacher can, you should try this in your district. Any teacher can identify themselves to students and saying, I'm somebody you can talk to about LGBT issues. And that really has the hope. There are thousands of these that are being put on to change the atmosphere in a classroom. And it doesn't just, leave it to a day or
yes, to me what changes the atmosphere in a classroom, having done this education for many years and having done a session recently in Brooklyn, is having an open conversation with the students about these issues and letting them voice their questions and fears and talk about it. And once you do that and open up the conversation, then you have a chance, I think, of changing the atmosphere and the relationships. I once had a teacher stop me on the subway and say, you came to my school, you changed our school completely just by doing a few sessions and opening up the conversation. So, I certainly hope something like lanyards can make a difference, but it's sanctioning the conversation that I think makes a big difference.
They're also talking about changing the curriculum, and as Jared Fox said to me,
very important,
so that the gay students, LGBT students, see themselves in the curriculum, and that the other students see LGBT people in history.
Absolutely.
That's part of the deal.
But unless you break the silence and allow actual conversations in a controlled atmosphere, not people hitting each other, I think it's going to be forever restrictive.
I was under the impression that it's still...
ask us questions.
Yes, I was under the impression it's still very hard for teachers to come out to their students in the schools, even in the New York City schools. But he says he knows a bunch who have now.
I know a bunch who have too, but look, the whole world is still scared and homophobic. A columnist for the Aspen Daily News newspaper, it couldn't be a more liberal town in the United States, wrote a column this last week coming out, and it was torturous to read this. He was so scared and so apologetic for who he was, and it took him so long to do it. And
I'm glad I got it over with in the 70s. It's hard to go back in the closet. Some people do.
It's hard for us who've been out for 40 years to fully identify with people who are still scared. I freely admit that. But really...
and yet, and again, I'll just use him as a reference, this Jared Fox, he came out when he was 13 in school, Catholic school, was bullied over it, and his mother took him out and put him in a public school, and he said it was great, and he started a Gay-Straight Alliance in that school, but 13 years old in Ohio. So he did it. I know people have done it in Utah when they were teenagers. I mean, lots of people are doing it.
There are a variety of experiences. There are a variety of situations. Some are easier than others, but...
the only ones not doing it are SAG-AFTRA award winners. More about which later.
Stay tuned for that. All right. The Department of Health and Human Services says that Medicare Advantage now will cover sex confirmation surgery.
We have a picture of the plaintiff. She's a 55-year-old Texas trans woman, Charlene Lauderdale, who was a disabled Air Force veteran, and her lawyer thinks that this will affect all government-funded programs and influence private insurers to cover gender reassignment surgery.
Well, here are a couple of other examples of the federal government making progress on this. The Federal Aviation Administration has announced easier rules for transgender pilots. They have an annual medical review, and they're
not going to classify them as having gender identity disorder anymore.
No.
That's the thing.
Gender dysphoria and a more accepting attitude. The Department of Defense is proposing expanding mental health care and all trans care, presumably for veterans, since they don't acknowledge they have trans people serving, although surveys seem to indicate there are, what, 10 to 15,000 trans people serving in the military? But whatever. They will not cover surgery yet, but they will cover all kinds of other care for veterans or people serving, I hope.
And speaking of all these, transgender issues, who did this study? Was it the Williams Institute? They found that they looked at the 17 largest school districts in the country and found that the number of complaints of trans people, transgressing and causing trouble because they used the facilities that were was zero.
None.
Media Matters did this. Media Matters did this.
That's correct.
Right.
On the other hand, terrible study of what's happening with Mormon kids.
Yes.
After the Mormon Church dropped its latest announcement, its revelation that gay people marrying was made them
apostasy.
Yes. And that they wouldn't baptize people, and they wouldn't
baptize the children of people in a gay marriage.
So there's a group called Mama Dragons, which is the Mormon moms of LGBT kids, and they say that the suicide of LGBT Mormon kids, young people, has soared since this latest revelation.
Since November. They're talking about that they have reports of 32 LGBT Mormons who have killed themselves since November.
Terrible.
This is the parents calling them. Thousands of Mormons, by the way, left the church in protest.
Yes.
Many publicly did this because it was so outrageous.
Yep. Should we mention this Harlem thing before we get into the veterans?
We've told you about that homophobic church in Harlem, Atla Church, is that the name of it? Reverend Pastor James Manning. He's a horrible anti-gay bigot. Well, he's not. He's behind in his payments, mortgage payments or something. He's being foreclosed on by the city. And so the Ali Forney Center, which is for homeless LGBT youth, across Siciliano stepped in and said, why don't we turn this into a shelter for homeless LGBT youth? It would truly be a triumph of love over hatred, Carl said.
There's also an LGBT religious group in Harlem and the whole uptown area that is fairly newly formed without any kind of site. And they want to bid for it, too. There's an auction, supposedly, on February 24th. We'll see whether the pastor succeeds in stopping the auction and holding on to his church, or whether others have a shot at it.
In Nevada, a trans man police officer, Brad Roberts, is banned from using the men's restroom unless he has genital surgery. So Lambda has filed an amicus brief in his suit, which is in federal court.
All right, let's do some good news. Donald Holman is an 82-year-old veteran living in Ohio who was dishonorably discharged in 1955 for being gay. He was the victim of a sting operation in Frankfurt, Germany in 1955. He was set up. I'm not sure he even had sex with the guy. Right. He just, had some interaction with him and was thrown out.
They were smoking out homosexuals.
Yes, they were. So 60 years later, Donald Holman is getting an honorable discharge. Roll tape.
I was born in Alabama, small town parish. And I decided to join the military because I wanted to be in the military. I wanted to serve my country. And I was very happy the time that I spent in it. Well, I went to training in South Georgia there at Fort Campbell, I think it was. That's wherever I can remember. And then ended up in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And after that, I was transferred and moved to Frankfurt, Germany. And in Frankfurt is where everything happened. I met young man, I guess, about my age at that time, on the sidewalk, and we started talking, and I don't know who made a move, but we didn't do anything either. Right after the conversation and move, it was just like a police officer behind me so it had to be in a sting operation. Well, I was immediately, like in the next 2 or 3 days, I was on an airplane back to New York, and discharged almost immediately, just bang, 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 you know, and no explanation, no conversation, no nothing. Oh, no, well, actually, if I had openly said why I was discharged, I would have never, back in those years, I mean, you would have been a piece of trash. And I didn't tell anybody. My family never knew it. My wife never knew it. Nobody knew it. But I was very successful in my life. And I married, had 3 children, which I'm very proud of. They're very successful. I have one in California as events planner, very successful. And I've been successful. I had 2 companies. One company, I had 2,200 employees, and I sold it, the human resource company, and I just had a great life. And I just look at it now and say, for what happened in the military, nobody can damage me for what and what I do today. My daughter from California was in, and we started talking about my military, and I finally acknowledged to her that I had been in the military and been undesirably discharged. And with that, she was very acceptable, had no repercussions, she had no upset about it, and she ended up getting in touch with Lori Gum with Stonewall, and then she and I and Lori got all of our paperwork together and sent it out to get our records. The fact that I'm 82 years old and I kept this all a secret, and I don't think it was the right thing to have been done. So many people have suffered the same thing I suffered. Well, we got the records thanks to Lori Gum and her work that she did, even though they said that they couldn't find the records to begin with. And then after a little bit of effort on our part, or Lori's part, they found the records. First they said they were burned. And now it's been so great that the records were found, application was made, and they came back and said to be a year. And Lori and myself has said, we can't wait for another year because I'm 82 years old. I'd like to get it solved, and we've asked Senator Brown to help us, and he has written a letter to the Army Department, so hopefully that will take care of it, and hopefully it'll do it soon. And I'd be so happy when the conclusion comes to this and I get my honorable discharge, and I'd be happy for my family and anybody that knows about it. And I hope that happens with every other person that was mistreated. And I'd like to suggest and say to those military people who has had this happen to them, move forward and try to get it changed. You'll be happier, and there's no need in you having to put up with it. So that's the way I feel about it.
It's never too late to stand up for yourself.
He did get the honorable discharge.
Yes,
so
very moving story.
And just to give you an example of how things have changed, in the every year there's something called the Military Spouse of the Year, which is a national competition, I guess. So
and it's for not necessarily being a good spouse, it's for doing service to the military community as a military spouse.
So the naval base at Coronado, California, which is San Diego, got together its nominee for the national competition for Military Spouse of the Year. And guess what? It is a man married to a man in the Navy.
Yes, it's legal now.
So I've heard.
It's legal to be out in the Navy.
And
it's legal to get married.
They have been embraced by the base, and it's a very touching story, and we have a local news report on that.
10 News military reporter Hannah Mullins has the uphill journey to get this far.
I was the kid who didn't want to be gay.
But there was no denying it.
So I graduated from instructor school today.
It's kind of hot.
Brian Alvarado met his husband online 2 years ago.
I'm proud that he put his head down and he did his work and he made it about the Navy and not about himself for 15 years. It is joyful that now he can have both.
With his head up.
With his head up.
Perhaps scarier than any moment in war was going to the unit's Christmas party.
Sorry, I'm gonna...
That moment when you said, "Hi, this is my boyfriend Brian," what is the reaction going to be?
I was sweating in my tuxedo.
But he was Matthew's rock.
And the unit as a whole took him in as part of the family.
That empowered Brian. He transformed what was basically a wives' club with facials and manicures to a true family readiness group, prepared for sudden deployment, tsunamis, and lockdowns. He raised money for a sailor whose house burned down, helped sailors buy homes, and vets get jobs.
That's why I married him.
And in an interview that's supposed to be about Brian,
I'm trying really hard not to cry.
it's about his husband.
He doesn't like being called a hero, but there's just no denying it.
Maybe that's why he was nominated.
It's just an overwhelming sense of being thankful.
And he'll find out on Monday if he makes it to the top 3 in the entire Navy.
My God.
It's a great story.
Yes. I want to note with sadness the passing of Michael Kennedy. He was a radical lawyer who started out by defending Huey Newton and the IRA and all kinds of groups like that, but he also defended our friend Father Bernard Lynch, who was falsely accused of molesting a kid in 1989 because he was a gay activist. And Michael Kennedy got the whole thing thrown out of court, and
Because it was trash.
And Bernard exonerated. But he was a terrific social justice lawyer. Lots of people in the various movements are missing him.
Freedom to Marry, Evan Wolfson's group, has finally officially closed its office, but it has kept its website, freedomtomarry.org, which will have all its archives on there, the entire history of the marriage movement. So you can go to, and current resources, you can go to freedomtomarry.org for all of that.
And
still.
in what may be, well, it's not an end to the saga, but we've told you for years about this Virginia-Vermont case of a lesbian couple. One of them became an ex-lesbian, and she left the relationship, and she took the child against the law and absconded to someplace where we don't know.
Central America is the best guess.
But a minister who aided her, Kenneth Miller, a pastor, who was no relation to Lisa Miller, who was the ex-lesbian, was convicted of helping her flee in 2012, but it finally went up to the Second Circuit, and they upheld the conviction, and he has to start serving his 27-month sentence on March the 1st.
Still no word on where Lisa Miller and her daughter
I hope it's a deterrent to the rest of you.
Yeah. Not a deterrent in Nebraska to the Family Alliance and Catholic Conference, which are opposing an update of the state marriage laws to conform to the Supreme Court decision.
I don't think you
No, let's continue to live in fantasy land and pretend that didn't happen.
I don't want to think you want to listen to the Catholics. The Archbishop of St. Louis, Robert Carlson, in the Minnesota abuse cases, said when he was chancellor there, he did nothing to stop the crimes, and there were hundreds of them. He said he didn't know it was illegal for priests to have sex with kids. He said this in a deposition. Oh, we've learned about the law now, and he understands that they were crimes. Monster.
Speechless.
All right.
So we'll move on to international news.
Yes.
Great news from India. You may remember that a court there got rid of the ban on homosexuality a few years ago, and then the India Supreme Court, hearing an appeal of that, said, oh, no. We're reinstating that sodomy law, that ban. And everybody went, oh, no. And it was horrible for a couple of years. And our side, in a last-ditch effort, went back to the India Supreme Court and said, look, you heard this with 2 judges. You really should have heard it with more judges. You really ought to be reconsidering this. And this week they decided, yes, they will allow a 5-judge panel to rehear the case and decide, and that is great news for us.
Vigils were held across the country to support that effort. In Italy, they also, the right wing tried to have a big 1 million person demonstrations across the country, and they only got tens of thousands on Family Day. Now, they're supposed to vote on that this week?
Maybe.
February 9th is the date, actually, next week, that they're supposed to vote on it.
On civil unions.
And, you know, it's civil unions, but, you know, 70% are for legalizing protections for relationships, but 24% only support adoption rights for gay couples.
This has always been a European carve-out.
Well, except that the more liberal groups say we're not taking the adoption part of it out of the bill, and that may, you know.
Oh, I like that.
And in Australia, the Conservative ruling party there still won't allow a vote in the parliament on same-sex marriage. They want a referendum. So the Labour Party there is trying a parliamentary maneuver to bring it out for debate.
Yeah. And the hideous former Prime Minister of Australia has been in this country speaking.
In this city. We couldn't find out where he was, and we would have demonstrated against him. Very anti-gay. And
Terrible.
He spoke to some complete, you know, right-wing. What was that?
Yes, about the need to preserve the heterosexual family. We're not against gay people, but we must preserve family values.
So his lesbian sister tweeted about how wrong he was.
The High Court in Colombia in South America will hear the marriage question again. They several years ago mandated that same-sex couples had to be given equal rights to straight couples, and the Congress promptly ignored them, refused to change the laws. So now and the Inspector General wanted all same-sex relationships voided. So the High Court will hear the marriage question again, and this time maybe mandate full marriage rights for same-sex couples. That's the hope.
Now, if you were in Pakistan last week, you may have been confused by your copy of the International New York Times. Can we show that picture?
Well, first let's show the picture of the two men. We've told you that there's a gay male couple in China who are suing for the right to marry. So the New York Times put a picture of them on their front page. It's just a gentle, like, peck on it may even be on the cheek. I'm not even sure whether that's the lips, whatever, but it was on the front page of the New York Times. So around the world, various countries publish versions of the New York Times. There's an international edition. So in Pakistan, this is what appeared on their front page. Nothing.
A big blank space.
Wow. The International New York Times in Pakistan, blank space above the fold.
Wow.
Yeah, so...
Well, which kind of drew more attention to the story, and it made me read the story. You know, these guys are very brave. They brought a district court case. It's the first time a case like this has been accepted. And one of the men said when he came out to his family at a party at 14, well, he was asked, he was a 14-year-old kid. Somebody at the party said, "Do you have a girlfriend?" He said, "No, I like boys." So his father,
he didn't know enough.
When they got home, his father kicked him, and he punched his father back and moved in with his grandparents, who welcomed and fed his boyfriends.
Superb. Now, we told you last week that in Britain, a straight couple was petitioning a court for equal rights to civil partnership. The court has rejected that claim, saying that there is no inherent right to a civil partnership, so the government is entitled to do with it as it wishes, including making it available only to same-sex couples.
Well, the judge also said that the United Kingdom was under no obligation to extend marriage to same-sex couples. They did, but they were under no obligation to.
The judge also said that the straight couple had not been discriminated against, but also said they can appeal. And said that, what was I going to say?
Well, Peter Tatchell, who was...
said you could get married.
Yeah, I know.
That's the point. They don't want to get married. They want to have a civil partnership.
Peter Tatchell, who's behind this, said that it's a sad defeat for love and equality. And
Peter Tatchell has also changed his mind on the Northern Ireland case of the cake bakers.
Yeah.
He put out a statement this week that said the couple that were prosecuted for refusing to put a pro-same-sex marriage message on a cake should not be prosecuted because it was about a specific message supporting same-sex.
I can agree with that.
Yeah.
I can agree with that. We're saying if you bake wedding cakes for straight couples, you should have to bake them for gay couples as well. But
to put a specifically political message,
I can agree with that.
Yeah.
We're big on the First Amendment here. They don't have one over there.
Can't we all just get along?
They're certainly not into it in and I will just say the Arab world. 6 Arab nations have banned the movie The Danish Girl for moral depravity. Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. Jordan said it promoted homosexuality and gender transformation. I guess you can't, they don't allow Gay USA over there either.
I haven't, well, we're on the internet.
We'll see. On
YouTube. I thought people objected to it just because they found it a little boring. I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it either. In the Church of England, there's a poll out of their members. 45% now support same-sex marriage, 37% are opposed. Nationally, 56% support, 27% oppose. I think that's for that. And
back to the Middle East.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Saudi Arabia, 2 male couples have been arrested supposedly for marrying each other, cross-dressing, consuming alcohol. It's the old story.
In Germany, 2/3 of people now want gay marriage legal, and 1/4 are opposed. Most conservatives support it now, but the Merkel government, including 61% of those who voted for Merkel, support it. But she's the one who's blocking the vote in Parliament. 68% of Catholics support it.
And in Russia, there is a story of a transgender woman murdered. And Angela Lekina, her ex-wife's boyfriend has been arrested on suspicion of the murder. Angela became famous for a video that showed up online of her being stopped by a cop for a traffic violation and him freaking out when he saw her driver's license, which had a male gender marker on it.
That's called transphobia.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And now she's been murdered.
All right.
AIDS news. A couple of big stories this week. The one that really freaked me out was this Bill Maher HBO show thing. I have such mixed feelings about Bill Maher, but he can be a real jerk.
That's exactly the word for him.
Yeah.
And he thinks that's funny.
Yeah, but you know, he does contemporary issues, so I sometimes tune into the show on Friday nights. And I tuned in last week, and he does an interview guest for a few minutes at the top of the show. And to my shock and horror, it was this guy who's a doctor in Mexico who had been treating Charlie Sheen, had been talked about on the Dr. Oz show by Charlie and Dr. Oz.
Dr. Samir Chachua?
Chichua, I think.
Chichua.
So when Dr. Oz was doing this, a 2-part interview with Charlie Sheen, Charlie says, I was on my meds, my regular meds, I was doing fine, but I wanted to try alternate things, and this guy was promising a cure. I went to Mexico. I went off my meds. I worked with him. I thought he was helping me, but now I find that my viral load has gone up again, so I'm not a fool. I'm back on my meds. So then this Mexican doctor shows up on Bill Maher. And Bill Maher is just giving him a platform to say, oh, yes, I found the cure. I've cured Charlie. Everything's fine.
Here's the cure. He uses the milk from arthritic goats to cure HIV. I mean, he's not even licensed in the United States. He won't say how his treatment works.
Spontaneous remission.
Maher loves to mock religion and say, you know, they don't accept science. Well, this is a complete AIDS denialism. It's just outrageous.
The doctor says there's a virus in goats that destroys HIV, protects users for life. All the side effects disappear from the regular meds. I saw this and I immediately emailed the top AIDS activists and treatment activists I know and said, you have to take a look at this.
If the soup was still on, that would be on there.
Have I lost my mind? And they all wrote back immediately, quack, quack, quack. This is outrageous. This guy should be prosecuted. And the idea that Bill Maher, out of such ignorance, and he sits there on the show and says, you know, people are going to criticize me for this.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Well, HBO should be criticized for even running it.
Unbelievable.
How about some censorship?
So please please, please, if anyone has led you to believe this stuff, do not. Even Charlie is back on his regular meds. I hope he's not the victim of the profiteering that is the next AIDS story this week.
I mentioned my friend, Father Bernard Lynch. He's going to be in New York from London, and they're going to be showing a movie made about him in the 1980s, AIDS, A Priest's Testament, when he did this heroic AIDS ministry work. It's going to be Saturday, February 13th at 2:30 p.m. at the community center, free and open to the public, and there'll be a discussion with Bernard afterwards.
Nice. What I was trying to segue to was the fact that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is suing Gilead for profiteering on tenofovir, which is one of the elements of both PrEP and PEP. And AIDS activists who have some arguments with the AIDS Healthcare Foundation are applauding.
Bitter disagreements, I would say. They're applauding this.
Applauding them for this. And the Massachusetts Attorney General is also investigating Gilead for their expensive Hep C drugs. And Congress is investigating drug profiteering. I don't know what they can end up doing with any of this stuff, but Martin Shkreli, the Daraprim vulture profiteer, is supposed to testify this week. He's going to plead the Fifth Amendment.
Well, how about price controls? They used them in the Nixon administration, for God's sake.
Shkreli says he's going to plead the Fifth and refuse to speak, but what he'd really like to do is berate and insult Congress members for having this hearing.
They can lock you up for that.
Yeah. And February 7th is Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. The theme is I am my brothers and sisters' keeper, fight HIV/AIDS. Again, a reminder, get tested, get treatment, be safe.
And stop using crystal meth. Yes, I'm being judgmental. It's on the rise again among gay men in New York City. Peter Staley reports this in Paz magazine with alarm after dramatic drops from 2004 to 2008 when they did a big anti-crystal meth campaign. And he says you can say goodbye to ending the AIDS epidemic in 2020 if you don't get this under control. And of course, we all have to watch out for the Zika virus.
1 minute left.
All right.
Queen Latifah did not come out at the SAG Awards. She started after she won the award for Bessie by thanking her partner and everybody.
But she and class, but
said, "Oh, she must have come out." No, it's her producing partner.
Kevin Spacey won too, and he didn't come out for House of Cards.
And Jeffrey Tambor won, and he did say Mona, the character he plays, is entitled. This is for those who can't afford medicines and surgery. That was nice.
And Titan Men is which is a porn company, is offering former Republican Congressman Aaron Schrock $1 million to pay off his legal bills if he'll sign an exclusive contract with them to do hardcore porn. He of the six-pack abs.
And next Tuesday night on Andy Cohen's Watch What Happens Live on Bravo, Teresa Giudice talking about lesbian sex in prison. Her cell known as the Boom Boom Room.
She didn't do it, she says.
See you next week. Thank you very much.
And
they're just rolling the credits now.
And we will see you next week.
All right. Well, evidently we have a few seconds. Kanye West says he's been accused of liking anal sex. He doesn't. Bye.
Bye-bye.